In May 2018, the world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the warmth of summer to fully arrive. For a 21-year-old student named Chloe Murphy, that particular weekend was supposed to be nothing more than a perfect escape into nature. She was a design major, a young woman who saw the world through a lens, quite literally. Her passion for visual arts and photography was not just a hobby. It was a way of understanding the universe around her. Her friends often described her as a bundle of energy, a meticulous planner who always kept her loved ones informed of her whereabouts. She was the kind of person who sent a text when she arrived somewhere and another when she was leaving. She was grounded, level-headed, and possessed a caution that blended seamlessly with her love for the outdoors. That weekend, Chloe and a group of friends decided to hike the Bright Angel Trail in the Grand Canyon. For those unfamiliar, this trail is one of the most famous and heavily trafficked routes in the entire national park system. It's well-maintained, clearly marked, and generally considered incredibly safe. It's the kind of place where thousands of tourists from all over the globe walk side by side, marveling at the geological wonders that have been carved over millions of years. Chloe's parents had no reason to worry when she shared her weekend plans with them. In fact, they were happy she was getting some fresh air and enjoying the beauty of their home state of Arizona. The weather on that particular day was idyllic. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the light played tricks on the red canyon walls, creating a photographer's dream. Chloe was in her element, constantly stopping to capture the interplay of shadows and light. Around midday, as the group was walking along a particularly scenic stretch of the trail, Chloe saw a composition that she just had to have. She decided to step off the main path just a few dozen meters to get a better angle. Her friends, used to her artistic detours, waved her on and continued walking. They assumed she would be right behind them in a few minutes. They knew Chloe. She was independent but responsible. However, those few minutes stretched into an hour and then two. Initially, the group wasn't alarmed. They figured she might have gotten engrossed in her photography or perhaps decided to head back to the campsite early because she was tired. It was a logical assumption. Chloe was a strong-willed and independent woman. Deviating from the plan was something she had done before. But as the sun began its slow descent towards the horizon, a chilling silence settled over the group. When they finally arrived at their campsite, the relief they had been holding onto evaporated. Chloe wasn't there. Her belongings were untouched, but her phone, which she always kept with her, was unreachable. It was in that precise moment that mild confusion morphed into the first terrifying stirrings of panic. They started calling her name, their voices echoing through the vastness of the canyon. But the only reply was the eerie resonance of their own screams, bouncing back off the ancient rock walls. When the news of Chloe's disappearance reached her parents, their world fractured. It was a moment that divided their lives into a distinct before and after. They received a frantic, disjointed call from one of her friends, and they immediately activated every possible emergency protocol. The thought that Chloe would simply wander off into the wilderness without a word was not just unlikely. It was unthinkable. They knew their daughter. She was a planner, a communicator. She would never take such a reckless risk. The Flagstaff Police Department responded to the missing person report with immediate urgency, launching a massive search operation that was unprecedented in scale for the area at that time. Rescue teams with trained search dogs, mountaineering experts who knew the treacherous terrain like the backs of their hands, and a legion of dedicated volunteers descended upon the Bright Angel Trail. They combed the area meter by meter. Helicopters equipped with state-of-the-art thermal imaging cameras buzzed through the canyons, scanning the depths for any sign of heat, for any indication that the girl had been there. The evidence at the scene was maddeningly scarce. The last people to see Chloe were her friends, and they could only point to a vague section of the trail where she had last wandered off. Investigators seized all of her electronic devices, scoured surveillance footage from the park entrances, and interviewed dozens of other hikers who had been on the trail that day. But the accounts were frustratingly contradictory or simply non-existent. Most people were so wrapped up in their own experiences that they didn't notice a young woman with a camera among the sea of other tourists. Weeks turned into months, and the Murphys' emotional state bordered on despair. Every hour that passed without news was a form of exquisite torture. They watched as the search and rescue teams returned from their shifts, empty-handed and exhausted. Every phone call brought a fleeting surge of hope that was instantly crushed as soon as they heard the voice of a police representative apologizing for the lack of progress. The Flagstaff Police Department began following protocols for cases where a lost person is highly likely, but the absence of a body, or even a single piece of torn clothing, created a suffocating atmosphere of inexplicable mystery. The Grand Canyon, which had always been a symbol of beauty and majesty, had become a silent, unyielding tomb. Then November arrived. The Arizona air had turned bitingly cold, and the desert landscapes around Flagstaff were painted in the muted browns and grays of the late autumn season. 7 long, agonizing months had passed since Chloe Murphy had vanished. For the authorities, the search had officially entered the cold case stage. The active, aggressive efforts to comb the area had been suspended. Hope in the town had gradually faded, transforming into a painful, silent memory that locals preferred to avoid in conversation. The case was all but forgotten by the national media, buried under the weight of newer tragedies. About 30 miles from the Grand Canyon, near the small, quiet town of Williams, life continued at its usual slow, uneventful pace. It was a region characterized by vast, open spaces and the ubiquitous sight of abandoned farmlands, relics of a bygone agricultural era that had long since lost its significance. It was precisely this kind of desolate location that fascinated a group of 3 teenagers. They were part of a subculture drawn to the eerie beauty of urbex, or urban exploration. They loved seeking out abandoned places, capturing the strange poetry of decay, where time seemed to stand still. Skeptics might call what happened next a fatal coincidence, but for these teenagers, it was supposed to be just another routine adventure. They planned to take a series of atmospheric photos for their social media feeds, looking for that perfect shot of crumbling infrastructure. A strong wind picked up, bringing with it dark clouds and a light, cold rain that forced the trio to seek shelter. They stumbled upon a half-ruined farm building, sitting alone and forgotten off the main roads. The walls were covered in a web of cracks, the windows gaped empty, and inside, a profound silence reigned, broken only by the creaking of old, stressed wooden beams. The air smelled thickly of mold and damp rot. The floor was a minefield of dust, broken glass, and years of accumulated household trash. Cautiously navigating the debris, the teenagers explored the first floor using the flashlights on their cell phones. In the corner of a large room stood a massive, dilapidated wooden wardrobe, covered in a thick layer of dust. One of the boys, trying to get a better view into a dark corner, accidentally bumped into the heavy furniture. From his nudge, the cabinet, which had clearly long since lost its stability, shifted to the side with a dull thud, revealing a section of the floor that looked surprisingly less damaged than the rest of the room. They found a trapdoor hidden beneath it. It had been concealed so skillfully that none of the casual visitors before them had ever noticed it. According to their later statements to the police, the teenagers expected to find nothing more than an empty crawl space filled with cobwebs and old junk. However, when they opened the heavy lid, they felt a draft that smelled not only of mustiness but also carried a strange, almost clinical scent. It was a sterile odor that felt profoundly out of place in the grime of the abandoned house. They cautiously descended the stairs into the basement. The light from their flashlights cut through the oppressive darkness, gradually revealing details that made them freeze in their tracks. This was no ordinary basement. It was a place where the concept of time had taken on a different, more sinister dimension. In the center of the room stood a neatly set table. It was a place setting for 2, laid out with almost theatrical precision. On the walls nearby were hung neatly printed sheets that looked like psychological compatibility questionnaires, complete with underlined points and intricate charts. On the table lay handwritten notebooks, their pages filled with headings about plans for a shared future. The entire scene created a profoundly eerie contrast with the reality of the dilapidated farmhouse. It was a grotesque parody of a home. Then, in the far corner where the beam of a flashlight fell, they saw her. It was Chloe Murphy. She was sitting on the floor, chained by a metal shackle to a massive concrete column that supported the building's ceiling. Her condition was critical. She was so emaciated that she looked almost skeletal, her skin pale and almost transparent. Her clothes were torn and filthy. The teenagers later described her gaze as completely vacant and glassy. She showed no reaction whatsoever to their arrival. She didn't scream, didn't call for help, and didn't even try to escape. It was as if she had been severed from the outside world, trapped in a deep, nearly catatonic trance after months of complete isolation. The shock was instantaneous and paralyzing. This wasn't a movie. This was life shattered in the most horrific way imaginable. They didn't dare get any closer, driven by a primal fear of whoever or whatever could have created such a place. The realization hit them within seconds. This was the same girl whose face had been plastered on every lamppost and featured in news reports across the state. They turned and ran, barely feeling the ground beneath their feet. The fresh air hit their faces like a physical blow, but they didn't stop until they were a safe distance away, finally getting a stable cell phone signal. Their very first call was to the police, their voices trembling as they gave the dispatcher the coordinates, unable to process the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. And so, thanks to ordinary human curiosity and a desire to find new filming locations, a chapter was closed in a story that many had already consigned to the dusty archives of unsolved mysteries. Within minutes, police cars with flashing lights began to surround the farm, transforming the quiet, godforsaken place into the epicenter of law enforcement activity. The officers, seasoned investigators who thought they had seen it all, were this time confronted with a situation that went far beyond their standard operating procedures. The air in the basement was heavy, saturated with the smell of dampness and that strange, almost artificial sterility that stood in stark contrast to the chaos of the dilapidated building above. Chloe was found in the very same corner where the teenagers had left her, barely reacting to the presence of the strangers. The paramedics who were the first to approach her described her condition as deep dissociation. She did not respond to her name, did not react to the light of the flashlights shone in her face, and showed no emotion even as the metal shackles were removed from her ankles. It was a defense mechanism, a way for her shattered mind to protect itself from the trauma she had endured. While the doctors carefully worked to stabilize Chloe's critical condition, a team of forensic investigators began a meticulous examination of the premises. Under the bright, unforgiving light of their lamps, the basement revealed more and more horrific details. Every object, every detail on the table, every printout on the walls. It was all part of a meticulously planned, albeit insane, scenario. The investigators documented every tiny thing, realizing that the key to identifying the monster who had been holding the girl captive was hidden somewhere in this gruesome tableau. It was while examining the table where the symbolic dinner had been set that one of the forensic investigators discovered a small scrap of paper. It was an ordinary receipt from a local coffee shop called The Daily Grind, located in downtown Flagstaff. Despite the dust coating everything else, the receipt looked surprisingly fresh. For the investigators, this was their first seemingly indisputable lead. Knowing that Chloe Murphy had been a frequent visitor to this establishment before her disappearance, they immediately assumed the receipt belonged to her. The logic seemed ironclad. The coffee shop was a popular spot among students and young people, and Chloe did indeed like to stop by there before class. The assumption that she might have somehow brought this receipt with her on the day of her disappearance, or that it had fallen out of her belongings, became the basis for their initial line of inquiry. It was a psychological trap. Professionals accustomed to working with logical sequences had jumped to conclusions too quickly, focusing on the victim's habits. They tried to reconstruct the timeline of Chloe's visits, hoping to find witnesses who had seen her on the day of her abduction. However, this lead turned out to be a massive red herring that diverted the investigation's attention from the paper's true owner. While investigators spent valuable hours checking customer databases and analyzing transactions, the real reason the receipt had ended up on the table remained a mystery. The grueling process of collecting biological samples began. Forensic scientists worked methodically, collecting DNA from every surface, from the metal chains with which Chloe had been bound to the psychological tests hanging on the walls. Every fingerprint, every strand of hair, every microparticle of fabric was packed away for analysis. The search for suspects widened. The police began questioning all residents of nearby farms and homeowners within a radius of many miles. They were looking for anyone who had access to the abandoned property, who could move about the neighborhood unnoticed. The local residents, shocked that such a horror had been happening right under their noses, began recalling suspicious individuals or strange sounds they had heard over the past few months. But the information was contradictory. Some had seen an unfamiliar pickup truck. Others had heard noises at night. Yet none of these accounts provided a clear profile of the perpetrator. The investigative team worked around the clock, documenting every step, every photograph taken of the basement, and every interrogation transcript. All of this created a massive body of data. The atmosphere of tension in the city was mounting as the realization that the criminal might be right next door forced everyone to look at their neighbors with suspicion. The case, which began as a mysterious disappearance, was turning into a complex puzzle where every detail, even something as small as a receipt, could either bring them closer to the truth or lead them into a dead end. And before we dive deeper into this truly terrifying puzzle, I have a small favor to ask. If you're finding this story as gripping as I did, please take a second to hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. Your engagement isn't just support, it's fuel for the YouTube algorithm, which helps me bring these stories to more people. Thank you for helping me share these important cases. The investigation, which just a few weeks ago had been riding a wave of initial success, was rapidly losing momentum, finding itself in a state of agonizing stagnation. The police station offices, cluttered with folders of documents and photos from the crime scene, seemed steeped in exhaustion and helplessness. Every step that had previously seemed promising now felt like wandering through thick fog. The atmosphere within the investigative team was growing increasingly tense. Pressure from management demanded immediate results, but the lack of concrete evidence created an explosive mix of frustration and anxiety. A prime suspect, whom they had managed to identify by analyzing surveillance footage from cameras near the national park, found himself in the spotlight because of his troubled past. He was a man whose record was rife with public order violations and run-ins with the law. His figure, captured on video, fit perfectly into the psychological profile the investigators were trying to piece together. However, when it came time to verify the facts, it turned out he had an ironclad alibi. Digital traces, financial transactions, and testimony from independent eyewitnesses completely refuted his involvement. It was a devastating blow to the investigative team, which had already built its primary theory of events around him. The public, fueled by numerous media reports, expressed outright outrage at the police's slowness. Chloe's parents, who had placed their full trust in law enforcement in the early days, began to lose faith. Each of their meetings with investigators turned into a grueling psychological battle where police promises clashed with the cold reality of fruitless searches. In a state of complete confusion, the investigation's leadership decided to change direction. The detectives decided to conduct a series of grueling interrogations of the girl's friends and boyfriend. The logic was cruel. Since they were the last people to have contact with Chloe, there was a high probability that they were hiding something. Perhaps they had conspired or were simply trying to protect someone in their circle. For several days, the young people were summoned to the police station, where they were held in isolation for hours on end, forced to recount the chronology of that fateful day over and over again. However, despite titanic efforts and hundreds of working hours, this approach yielded no results. No evidence of a conspiracy, no signs of lying. It was time lost forever, which only deepened the sense of hopelessness. The investigation had reached a dead end when one of the rank-and-file employees, engaged in the routine cataloging of physical evidence from the basement, accidentally noticed a minor detail that no one had previously taken into account. It was the very same receipt from the coffee shop. Previously, it had been largely ignored, dismissed as everyday trash. However, upon closer inspection, the investigator noticed a specific notation printed in tiny type, staff meal. This abbreviation was used exclusively by the establishment's internal staff to mark orders charged to the employee's meal allowance, not to customers. The implication was staggering. The receipt could not have belonged to Chloe since she was a customer, not an employee. Furthermore, the paper looked too fresh, its texture too clean for an item that had been lying in a damp, dusty basement for 7 months. Further analysis confirmed the crucial point. There were absolutely no fingerprints on the check from Chloe or any of her acquaintances. This definitively disproved the theory that she or one of her friends had brought the paper to the place of confinement. It was a discovery that changed everything. The receipt did not belong to the victim. It belonged to the kidnapper. This meant that the criminal had direct access to the coffee shop's internal ordering system. He was someone on the inside. The investigators, who until that moment had felt like blind kittens, suddenly saw a clear path forward. The question was no longer who might be an outsider, but which of the cafe's employees had the opportunity to take advantage of the staff meal program while also being involved in the girl's disappearance. The turning point came when the investigators' attention shifted from the outer circle of suspects to those who were around her every day. Those who, at first glance, were part of Chloe's familiar surroundings, but were actually hiding behind a mask of ordinariness. The realization that they were looking for someone integrated into the girl's life on the level of her morning coffee opened the door to understanding the true nature of what had happened. All the previous mistakes, all the time wasted on fruitless interrogations, were now seen as a necessary, albeit painful, stage. Without it, they would never have arrived at this obvious truth. The puzzle began to come together, and at the center of this picture was a person who had previously been just one of many names on the list of the establishment's employees. The investigation moved into a phase of meticulous, almost surgical scrutiny of every witness who might have had even the slightest contact with the girl in the days leading up to her disappearance. The daily grind, located in one of the city's busiest neighborhoods, became the focus of attention. For the detectives, this establishment was a point of reference, the last place where Chloe had been seen in a normal, everyday setting. Law enforcement understood that any small detail, a forgotten conversation or a fleeting glance, could be the crucial piece of evidence that would lead them to the kidnapper. The police proceeded methodically. Every barista, every waiter, and every kitchen staff member who might have been on shift when Chloe visited the cafe was interviewed. The detectives asked about everything. Whether she was alone, whether she seemed upset, whether she came in at the same time every day. The atmosphere in the cafe had changed, transforming from a cozy place to relax into an interrogation room where every employee felt the weight of responsibility. Jordan Murphy, a 30-year-old coffee shop employee, was one of the first people the investigators questioned. His professional experience, calm demeanor, and confidence during conversations made him one of the people who aroused the least suspicion. During the series of interviews, Jordan behaved impeccably. He answered questions clearly without unnecessary emotion, yet demonstrated genuine concern for the girl's fate. He seemed to be a real find for the investigators, a caring witness ready to tell them everything he had seen. According to his own testimony, he not only remembered Chloe but also noticed details that would help the investigation. Jordan recalled that during the girl's last visit to the cafe, her behavior was unusual. She seemed depressed, avoided eye contact, and her boyfriend, who had also visited on multiple occasions, allegedly treated her coldly and dismissively. His account sounded very credible, painting a picture of a relationship in which Chloe was the victim of psychological pressure. This led the detectives to look for conflicts in her personal life. Jordan's colleagues also confirmed that he was a friendly and professional employee. Some recalled that he might have paid Chloe a little more attention than other customers, but they didn't see anything suspicious in that. In the service industry, such politeness is considered the norm. His sincerity seemed genuine, and his willingness to help only strengthened the investigators' trust in him. They saw him as an ordinary citizen caught up in a tragic story, and that was their fatal mistake. However, despite the apparent perfection of Jordan's testimony, the investigation was not making progress. The stories about a toxic guy were not corroborated by other evidence, and the overall picture remained unclear. While the detectives focused on the human factor, the forensic department continued its monotonous, grueling work of analyzing massive amounts of data. Thousands of hours of video footage were reviewed from surveillance cameras installed at city entrances, parking lots, shopping centers, and remote gas stations near the area where the basement was discovered. Police analysts worked around the clock, reviewing every single frame. Their goal was to identify any vehicle that had retraced its route near the area in the days leading up to the disappearance. It was a task that required incredible concentration and patience. Once the analysis of surveillance footage from remote gas stations was complete, the investigators' attention focused on one specific vehicle. The video recordings showed an old pickup truck. It appeared in the footage with alarming regularity. This was not a random car passing by. The vehicle was following a clearly defined route, and its appearance in the area where the search operations were taking place could not have been a coincidence. The regularity with which this vehicle appeared during the critical days prompted analysts to pay special attention to it. They began the identification process. The detectives tasked with verifying the registration data launched a search for the owner based on the license plate number and make. The verification process was quick as the database operated automatically. When the owner's information appeared on the monitors, silence fell over the investigator's office. The car belonged to none other than Jordan Murphy. This fact marked a turning point in the entire investigation. The entire case they had built on the testimony of the cooperative witness crumbled instantly. The person who had been sitting across from them just yesterday, talking about toxic relationships and helping the investigation, turned out to be the owner of the very car captured on surveillance footage near the girl's place of detention. The person they had considered a source of information suddenly became the central figure in the case. Yesterday's concerned witness had become the person whose life now had to be subjected to the most rigorous scrutiny. The puzzle was beginning to come together into a complete, horrific picture where every detail pointed to his direct involvement. The bond of trust had been broken, and now every word Jordan had spoken earlier was perceived not as assistance to the investigation but as a carefully constructed line of defense intended to divert attention from the actual evidence. Sensing this abrupt turn, the investigative team began preparing for an entirely different interrogation scenario, realizing they were dealing with someone who wasn't merely an observer, but the direct architect of the events. A palpable silence reigned in the interrogation room. Jordan sat in a metal chair, maintaining outward composure. His answers to the investigators' questions were clear, measured, and on the surface entirely logical. When asked directly why his pickup truck had appeared on a remote road near the crime scene, not a single muscle betrayed his nervousness. His cover story had been prepared in advance. He was simply an avid hiker searching for new little-known trails to photograph, where the light fell beautifully on the red rocks. He spoke about it with enthusiasm, as if he were an ordinary tourist in love with nature rather than a man whose life was unraveling before the eyes of law enforcement. The detectives conducting the interrogation professionally maintained neutral expressions. They knew that any display of emotion could signal the suspect to change tactics. However, the situation changed radically when the results of the forensic analysis were placed on the table in front of Jordan. The key piece of evidence was a blanket used to cover Chloe Murphy in that damp basement. Forensic experts had conducted microscopic analyses of fibers extracted from the fabric, comparing them to thousands of samples collected during the searches. The results were staggering. Spectral analysis showed a perfect match between synthetic fiber microparticles found on the blanket and the material from which Jordan's work uniform was made. This was not ordinary contamination from accidental contact. The density and pattern indicated that the uniform fabric had been in prolonged and direct contact with the object covering the victim. When investigators presented this evidence, the calm facade Jordan had maintained cracked for the first time. Under the weight of irrefutable facts, the innocent barista story began to crumble like a house of cards. Every statement he had made, every attempt to present himself as a helpful witness, was now viewed through the lens of his obvious guilt. But instead of acknowledging the obvious, Jordan chose the path of desperate manipulation. Feeling the noose tighten, he changed tactics, shifting from calm confidence to aggressive defense. He began spreading theories that someone was trying to frame him. He claimed he was the victim of a conspiracy. According to him, real criminals, knowing about his infatuation with Chloe, had planted fibers from his clothing to lead the investigation down the wrong path. The claim was so absurd in light of the evidence that even experienced detectives were speechless. Jordan didn't stop there. He began building his defense by discrediting Chloe's circle of friends, trying to shift the blame onto her boyfriend. His argument seemed almost theatrical. He kept coming back to how he had noticed Chloe's boyfriend treating her badly during her last few visits, how she looked depressed and exhausted after talking with him. Jordan tried to convince the investigators that this man had every motive to harm the girl, while he, Jordan, was merely a victim of circumstance. He manipulated facts, took words out of context, and tried to use Chloe's parents' emotional state against her loved ones. The investigators watched these antics with professional composure. Every attempt by Jordan to shift the blame only drove him deeper into a corner, as it contradicted the body of evidence they had gathered. Work in the Flagstaff police offices didn't stop for a single minute. Experts double-checked every detail, cross-referencing the timeline of Jordan's shifts with data on his movements. None of the theories about other culprits stood up to scrutiny. Jordan continued to cling to his version, which was becoming increasingly unconvincing. His psychological state became a subject of discussion among the psychologists involved. They noted a distinctive trait. The suspect wasn't simply defending himself. He was trying to rewrite reality by imposing his own narrative on the investigators. This stubbornness suggested that the man had not only committed a crime but was also deeply convinced of his own ability to control others' perceptions. The atmosphere in the city remained tense. People who learned the details could not fathom how one man could skillfully play two roles at once: a caring acquaintance concerned about the missing girl and the person behind her disappearance. For the investigative team, however, everything was falling into place. The fragments of uniform fibers on the blanket had become the missing link. The work continued, and each passing hour brought further confirmation that they were dealing with a person whose crime was as carefully planned as his attempts to evade responsibility. The investigators understood that every move Jordan made, every fabricated story he told, was merely a testament to his powerlessness in the face of facts that no words could change. The team left no stone unturned in his attempts to shift the blame onto others. The suspect's claims that Chloe's boyfriend was the abuser became the subject of a meticulous investigation. They obtained phone records, checked bank statements and social media histories, and gathered testimony from dozens of witnesses who might have seen the couple. However, they found not a single piece of evidence supporting Jordan's allegations. On the contrary, all evidence indicated that Chloe's relationship was stable and free of violence. It became clear that the abuser narrative was not merely manipulation but an attempt by Jordan to exploit social stereotypes to divert suspicion. While Jordan insisted on his fabricated defense, forensic experts were wrapping up work at his residence. In addition to the primary evidence, a small, inconspicuous digital voice recorder was discovered in a secret compartment of a closet. This item, which appeared to be an ordinary household trinket, later became the key to understanding the depth of the suspect's criminal activities. Analysts would later describe it as the black box of the crime. When experts began transcribing the recordings, a picture emerged that stunned even the most seasoned veterans. The voice recorder contained hundreds of hours of audio footage. These were not random recordings. They were a systematic chronicle of the crime. Jordan had recorded his every move, every stage of preparation for the kidnapping, and a detailed audio plan of exactly how he intended to keep Chloe in isolation. He wasn't acting on instinct. He was preparing with a methodicalness bordering on madness. These recordings became irrefutable proof that the crime was a prolonged, meticulously planned, and premeditated act that had been in the works for months. When investigators pieced the puzzle together by cross-referencing the recordings with Chloe's own testimony, the situation took an even more chilling turn. After the girl recovered somewhat, she told officials what had been happening in the basement. According to her, Jordan came to see her every evening and read aloud his notes, which he called a rule book for their family. This rule book, filled with irrational dreams of a life together that existed only in his imagination, was identical to what he had recorded. The match was complete. Every demand, prohibition, and romantic fantasy described on the voice recorder was voiced by him during his visits. This journal was not just a collection of texts but a tool of psychological pressure. Jordan tried to convince Chloe that their life together was perfectly normal, that she was his chosen one, and that all previous events were mere preparation for their union. For the investigation, these recordings were the final nail in the coffin. They completely disproved the image of the friendly barista. A different person was revealed to the court and the public, a cold-blooded criminal whose mask had fallen, exposing a being capable of endless cruelty under the guise of everyday life. The work of gathering evidence continued, with investigators describing in detail every minute captured on the voice recorder. They understood that each file was another nail in the coffin of Jordan's reputation and freedom. The scale of his obsession was so vast that even a cursory review caused deep psychological distress among the team. This was not just a kidnapping case. It was a case of complete loss of humanity, recorded on digital media by the perpetrator himself. The public, which had previously harbored doubts, now had definitive confirmation of guilt. As details of the recordings leaked to the media, Jordan's image as a friendly neighbor vanished forever, giving way to a horrific reality. Everyone who had known him was now forced to reevaluate their past interactions. This revelation came as a shock to Flagstaff. People who had previously ordered coffee from him now realized with horror that they had been served by someone who, in the darkness of the basement, had been plotting enslavement and violence. Jordan, who had hoped until the very end that his defense strategy would succeed, found himself completely isolated. His manipulations, his attempts to shift blame, his stories about real criminals, All of this became meaningless in the face of the evidence he himself had created. He had documented his own crime, believing no one would ever access his archive. It was a fatal mistake by a man who thought himself smarter than the system but who ultimately became its victim. The investigators continued working with concentration, as each new file revealed fresh details about how the crime had been planned. They studied Jordan's methods, his approaches to selecting victims, his surveillance tactics, and his methods of disguise. This information was invaluable for understanding the nature of such crimes. The investigation had effectively obtained a manual on how the mind of a person prone to this specific form of aggression works. Not a single word, action, or document was overlooked. Every page of the diary was checked for authenticity, and every recording was verified by experts. Jordan's case became one of the most thoroughly documented of its kind in the state's history. The justice system was preparing for a decisive step, and now that the mask had been torn off, nothing could stop the inevitable. Every detail, every second of audio, served to establish the truth once and for all, leaving no room for doubt or future appeals. Investigators understood they were dealing not merely with a kidnapper, but with a person whose inner world had been warped by a thirst for control. It was only through painstaking work that they brought this darkness to light, making it accessible for objective evaluation within the framework of current legislation. The situation became unbearable for Jordan when intelligence about his involvement spread among Flagstaff's patrol crews. Realizing the search was closing in, he decided to leave town. His plan was simple: cross the state line to the north, hoping to get lost among the highways. However, law enforcement agencies acted with unprecedented coordination. A description of his pickup truck, which had become a key piece of evidence, was sent to all highway patrol posts within minutes of confirming his guilt. The arrest took place on the outskirts of the city near a major interchange. Patrol officers blocked his path, leaving no chance to maneuver. When they drew their weapons and ordered him out of the vehicle, Jordan offered no resistance. He stepped out slowly, raising his hands in the air, as if he were not a cornered criminal but a man simply performing a necessary ritual. His face showed no fear, only a strange, almost fanatical disappointment typical of those whose plans have been shattered by circumstances beyond their control. During the initial interrogation after his arrest, his behavior shocked even seasoned detectives. Instead of remorse or attempts to justify himself, Jordan began laying out his version of events, which more closely resembled a sermon. He spoke with such sincerity that a heavy silence fell over the room. He did not consider himself a kidnapper. On the contrary, he insisted he was a true savior, the only person who understood Chloe's true nature. According to him, he was trying to protect her from what he called the wrong world and a toxic guy who, in Jordan's opinion, did not deserve such a woman. His monologue revealed the depth of his obsession. He proudly described his so-called bonding tests conducted in the basement, considering them a necessary stage of upbringing and preparation for their future together. For him, this was not a crime but a complex psychological strategy aimed at purifying the object of his passion from society's influence. The investigators listened with revulsion, realizing they were facing a man whose mind had created a distorted reality where abduction, violence, and prolonged captivity were interpreted as expressions of care and love. This was not a spontaneous act of aggression. It was a cold-blooded, months-long trap orchestrated by a person who had completely lost touch with a moral compass. While Jordan awaited his court hearing, Chloe Murphy began her long, difficult journey toward recovery. According to psychologists, the rehabilitation process was fraught with challenges. She had to learn how to trust people again, set boundaries, and return to a normal rhythm of life that had been brutally interrupted by months of violence. Every step in her recovery required tremendous effort, as the trauma inflicted by a man she knew simply as a barista turned out to be far deeper than any physical harm. She was forced to piece her identity back together, gradually rebuilding the sense of security that had been shattered in the farm's basement. This story remains a stark reminder of just how fragile ordinary life can be. Jordan's case set a precedent, forcing many Flagstaff residents to look at their daily routines differently. They recalled how they'd walk into a coffee shop, get their morning coffee, and exchange pleasantries with the staff without suspecting that an abyss might lie behind an ordinary smile. Sociologists and criminologists noted that danger often lies not in those who look threatening but in those who blend perfectly into the everyday landscape, becoming an integral part of it. The truth that emerged turned out to be far more terrifying than any speculation. The crime was made possible by simple trust in the ordinary. A person who served coffee had the opportunity for years to observe, select, plan, and carry out a sinister scheme, all while remaining unnoticed. This case taught us that the cold truth is often hidden behind the most ordinary facades, and sometimes the most terrifying monsters are the ones who greet us every day from behind a counter. The case was closed, but the aftermath forever changed the lives of many, leaving behind a heavy sense of reflection about who we truly see when we look at those around us. Life in Flagstaff gradually returned to normal, yet the feeling that silence isn't always a sign of peace was etched into the memory of everyone who knew the details of what had been happening in the darkness of that basement for many long months.